Hello and welcome to another episode of The Clever Dev. Today we're going to work on the Material UI Select component, and I have TypeScript enabled. So you can see right here I've got a placeholder value, we've got this helper text, and right now I've just got single select enabled. You can see that the label bumps up to the top there. We've got this little bit of an offset here in the menu for the select, offset from the input section, which is this area here. So we're going to dive in and have another great video. Here we are with a clean slate. We have our select component. You can see that it's not even getting initialized with anything in it. And so let's jump over to the code. I have a little bit of setup done over here, not too much though. I've got the imports that I'm going to need just to save the time. You can see that I've created this state value of score, and we have our score data here. And we've got a form control wrapping our select, and that's all we've got so far. So you noticed that our select component didn't have any values initialized. It's maybe not quite the right way of saying it. It does see the score values up here, or it has the score state, but right now that's just set to an empty string. So basically it just has no value in there right now. We're going to first start with the rendering of the data, and then the next step after that will be, and by rendering of the data I mean the rendering of the options in the menu when you click on the select component. Then after that we'll put in a handler, basically get our select functional, then we'll worry about the cool customization like the dropdown and so on. So first things first, we've got this array of score data, so let's just use a simple mapping to get it in place. So pretty common technique here to do something like this, score data.map, or whatever our array is, do a .map on it. So I'll say score value for the individual values. And we simply need to, with each iteration, return something that actually can be rendered so that there's visible options for our select value in the menu. So we'll say that the value is the score value element, element from our array, and here we go with the text score value. So simply having that, as long as we've closed all of our curly braces and everything, yeah, it looks good. Then now we should be a little better off over here. So that's step one. You can see nothing's happening when I select anything. So step two of basic functionality is simply to get our change handler in there. So on change, I'll just leave that for a moment, and I'll create a function up here called handle change. I think it's good practice to put your event handlers, or have the code for your event handlers to be separate from your JSX. Just makes it a little cleaner, a little more abstract. You can look at the JSX and know exactly what's going on. So I'll get that down in here. And this is a .tsx file, so it's going to be expecting TypeScript typings. So I will go ahead and do that before we try to even code the handle change. So there's two different parameters that can be passed in. I'm only going to use this event, but I'll go ahead and add the other one just so that you can see it. So I've already imported the select change event. So we've got our event, it's of type select change event, which expects string values. So there's that. I'll go ahead and add the child, which is the other parameter that gets passed in here. So it's just a React node. It's whatever item got clicked on. So this child can have useful values. Some of them are kind of duplicate values, you could say, to the event, but and I'll get into that a little bit more in a moment. So all that we really want from our handle change is that it does that it sets the score value. So we're going to make use of our state handlers setter, and we'll just say event.target.value, and that should be good enough for our set score once it updates. It will eventually. Sometimes VS Code doesn't see it even though the compiler is already happy with it. So there it went. Let's refresh this, and we'll see what we have here. There we go, functionality, fantastic. All right, got the basics out of the way. And just as a note, I will save the multi-select for the end of the video. The TypeScript typing's a little bit more complex on that. That's not the reason I'm saving it. The reason I'm saving it is just so that we can get all the other cool stuff done. And then I'm actually going to have to significantly change a few of these things, like this handle change will have different code inside of it to handle multi-select. Basically, with multi-select, everything will go from score being a string to score being an array of strings, and so we just have to check for things like length and so on some of the conditional rendering we'll do. So anyway, we've got basic functionality in here with our click handler. So the next thing that we're going to do is we'll add in a label and label text. So a quick note here, what we could do is we could actually, instead of just using the select component, which you may have noticed is very similar looking to an input and also very similar looking to a text field, we could, especially since it's wrapped in form control. Anyway, we could just use a text field. It actually has a select prop on it that you just set to true. Now, I haven't really dove into it. I don't know. Dove into it very much, so I don't know for sure that all the same functionality exists if you turn a text field into a select component, but I would expect so. Anyway, with that aside out of the way, what we're going to do is I'm just going to manually for now add in a label and helper text. So you may have noticed this is the outline variant that we have going on here for our input, for our select. I keep calling it an input because it basically is one. Anyway, for our select, but we don't have a label in here. When there was placeholder value, that existed before I select. I will add that, excuse me. But right now we don't have one, and yet there's no label. So we need to add that. We need to make sure that it pops up here at the right time. That gets a little bit tricky when you have a placeholder value. But anyway, first things first, let's just get that label. And so I'm going to use input label. If you're wrapping in form control, input label is like the form component that you want to use. So anyway, and it plays well with the select. So I'll give it an ID, custom select label, and it automatically close that for us. So let's just say score. So it's compiled successfully. I pretty much ignore the red squigglies in VS Code these days because it's just so slow. And already we see our label there. So far, I know this probably all seems pretty simple, but it's going to get pretty complex and interesting once we start working on the placeholder, and especially once we get into the multi-select. So kind of last simple thing here, I will add a form helper text, and I'll probably need to add in some margin, but we'll get to that in a minute. So got our form helper text. We have our form helper text. There it is. How nice. Actually, what we need to do is remove that margin. If you look at the examples in the MUI docs, then like the text field examples, for instance, then they don't have this little bit of gap right there. Let's look at that in the DOM real fast and see what's going on. Always good to do. Already I could tell, just highlighting over it, look, it's obviously got some left, top, and right margin. So anyway, the only one that I care about is this margin left. That's exactly what we want to do right there. So real fast, I'm just going to go in here. I'm going to add an SX value, and I'm going to say something simple, margin left 0. That should be all that I really want to do here. There it goes. Let's refresh that, make sure it's not just that I changed it over here in DevTools. Nope, we're good to go. So, like I said, that's kind of the simple stuff out of the way. The next thing we're going to add is a placeholder. So, an interesting thing, and I've got the docs pulled up here, the route that they pursued is they actually added a menu item on top of like an initial menu item as a placeholder, but then also in their render value, which is used to control how the selected item is displayed in the actual input portion of the select. They also are returning literally an element, an emphasized element that just has the text placeholder if nothing is selected. So I don't know why they did both things. We can see the outcome of it up here. It seems kind of strange to me because then they wind up with this disabled menu item. So that's not the route that I'm going to pursue. I'm basically going to use this render value portion, and I am not going to use this disabled menu item. So anyway, back to our code over here, and I've added this display empty, and what that does is pretty much what its name is. Let's something get displayed if there is nothing selected so far. So anyway, let's get our render value in here, and it is the method that we'll use for adding a placeholder. So I'm going to just give it value, keeping that pretty generic. Could have called it score, perhaps. So what I'm going to say is if there's a value, fantastic, just render that value. Otherwise, I'm going to do an emphasized element, and we're just going to say nothing selected. So simple as that, we've got that nothing selected text, but just a moment ago I mentioned that the label needs to be conditionally rendered because this happens. And the docs actually call that out. If you look at the API portion especially, it calls out this fact that this is a thing that happens. This isn't just like I did something dumb. More appropriate to say I just have not done the smart thing yet and conditionally rendered this. So we're going to steal this concept where if there's no value, we do something special. And I'm going to apply that concept up here. So let's get that conditional rendering in place. And what we're going to say is just pretty simple. We're going to say score, do this, otherwise do nothing. So this score value is, of course, our state value up here. So this is actually only part of what we need. It looks better so far, but watch what happens. Oh, that's interesting. So sometimes what will happen is, oh, here's what we need. So yeah, so I was forgetting which way the bug went. If you only add conditional rendering there, so you can see that our score goes up here. That's just like root function or core functionality built in by MUI into the select component and also into the outline variant of the text field. So what we can do then, we actually need another label prop within the select. It's kind of an interesting way that they've done it. You'd think that it would be a little smarter. And I actually should have done this a moment ago when we had our placeholder value. But anyway, for now, I'm actually going to give this a value of score so you can see what happens. If I don't conditionally render that, let's refresh this. So that's not quite how it should be. So let's actually conditionally render this, and we'll see how it goes. Actually, I think the problem there was that I didn't get the right value in here. So let's refresh this one more time, see what happens. Okay, so we're good. Here's the bug that I was expecting originally. So right now, if I've just got the dropdown opened, it thinks that it needs to put the value of score up there. And it gets that from right here. It says, okay, the label is going to have text of this length. But the really weird thing is it actually takes this value then and puts it up there. Let's see what happens just if I comment this out. Maybe it'll just take it from the label prop. But nope, it's not that smart. So like I said, this is all kind of a strange setup. To work properly with the outline variant, you need both this score label, the score input label, and you need a label prop in order to get the gap that we expect in the outline. And this, of course, supplies both the text in the input box and in the gap. But we need to conditionally render both of them when we have this placeholder value. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add score. If score exists, it's going to kind of sort of render this score value, except it's actually just going to take the spacing from that and then render this input label. And otherwise, do nothing. Now everything should be working just fine. Hate it when I do that. There we go. All right. I'm going to let this fully load. So we've just got placeholder text in there. Now when I do this drop down, nothing is selected yet. So the score value, that state value, is still just an empty string. Basically, it takes up no space. So the input says, okay, I don't need to make a gap here because my label value right now is just empty string, which takes up no space. But then as soon as we select a value, it takes the input label, pops it up there, and makes the gap based on this label prop. So kind of convoluted. The nice thing is that we don't have to worry about any of that with the form helper text. So we've talked about the placeholder value. You may also want just like no display value, and we pretty much saw that in the beginning. All you have to do there is have an empty string for your use state. One more thing that I'll show is if you wanted to start out with a value, you can do that as well. Let's say we're going to start out with 100. So here we go. It's starting out with a value of 100. Now my conditional rendering is already in place, but you'll need that even if you have a default value if you also have labels. All right, it's time to move on to perhaps the most challenging single thing that we're going to do here, the most complex single bit of functionality. No, it's not multi-select. It is the drop-down offset, I'll say. I'll call it an offset. Really what I'm going to do is shift to the right by, let's say, 30 pixels when we open up this little menu item. So what that's going to require, just to talk through it first, that's going to require a ref on this component here, because what we want to do, obviously I've got it in the middle of the screen right now. If I just try to say left 30, that's not going to be relative to this. It's just going to override whatever positioning we see here in the DOM. And one nice thing is that this is pretty easy to click into. This is actually a menu component. And let's see if I can find it in the DOM here. So other components use a popper. This one's actually not using a popper, and we can verify that because if we search for popper in here, we see popper styling just as one of the loaded files, but oops, not pepper. Paper. Our actual component is rendered using this paper class, and it would have a popper class on it. It may also have a paper. This is getting confusing with these names. But anyway, I see MUI menu-paper. So this is a menu component, not a popper. So I mention all that just because it's relevant for if you wanted to do styling, and I have another article on styling where I really dive deep into it. But anyway, if you want to do styling on this, you need to know that it's not a popper, it is a menu, and also it actually makes it a lot easier to select it with DevTools and examine the DevTools. So anyway, what we're going to have to do, the reason I opened it, is so that we can take a look at this left value here. So that's what we're going to be fiddling with, but we want to keep this internal calculation that was performed, and we want to just add or subtract or whatever. In this case, I'm going to add a value of 30 to our left, to this left value, which ultimately shifts it to the right. I could have also done that by saying something, changing the right value. But anyway, we're going to dive in to the code to do that. And it's a little bit complex and long, so first what we have to do is we have to know the correct prop for being able to change the menu styling, whether it's left or the background color or whatever the value is that we want to change. So the way that Material UI does it is they actually have us pass props down to the appropriate component. And so this is kind of a pattern, you could say, that I observe a lot in Material UI. It really threw me for a loop for a while, but once you get the hang of it, then you kind of know to expect it. So the first thing that we're doing is we're going to be able to pass props into the menu, right? Let's say I just try to change the SX value at this level. It might change this input, but this menu is totally separate in the DOM. You can kind of get a feel for that because you can see here in the DOM, it's well below all these script stylings. The input is somewhere like way up here in the DOM. Like if I scrolled really high, you see where I'm putting the scroll bar. I'm not going to go find it right now for the sake of time, but anyway, the menu is not a child of the input. It looks like it in our code, but it's not in the DOM. That's really important to understand. So anyway, it also looks like it because of how they positioned it, but it's not a child of the select or of the input in the DOM. So with that said, the implication then is that we need these menu props in order to be able to properly pass styling or whatever else to our actual menu component. So within the menu component, its topmost component is that paper component that we saw, or really the div with paper class on it that we saw in the DOM. So if I want to change the left value there, then what we got to do is something like this. We have to target the paper props and say left value is, I'm going to go ahead and use string interpolation syntax because we're going to need it in a little bit, but I'm going to say left value is 10px. So I'm going to leave it like that. It's not actually going to work, and I'll show you why. So here we go. It's in the same spot. You might be thinking, well, we just added a value of 10. Why isn't it being applied? Well, it actually is, but notice that we are using inline styling up here. And I say we are using, I mean MUI is using it. Go down here. Look, it's our poor left 10px, but it's applied. Ultimately, SX resolves to a class, and so their inline styling is trumping that. So I hate to use important, but we're going to use important. So this 10px is not really going to do what we want, but you see it over here. This is why we need it relative to the select components value here. But I just wanted to show you how it worked. Now we see this left is being overridden. Why they use inline styling in MUI to do this calculation, I'm not sure. My guess is that it's something about how this is detached from the DOM. Not sure, but anyway, the implication is if we're going to use typical styling APIs like SX, then we have to use important. So now that we've figured out simply how to access the proper left value, let's dive into making it dynamic. So that's going to require a ref. So I will simply, I've already imported useRef, and let's go ahead and oops, not import, input component. Go ahead and get this code in here. I'm going to leave the typing off for just a minute. Dive into that in a moment. Ref here. Now we need to say that the ref on our select is this input component. And in theory, what I could do now is I could go in here. In fact, I'll go ahead and do it. What we could do is say input component dot current dot get bounding. Let's see, I always have to remember this. Bounding client rect dot left. All right, this is not going to work. I expect that, but this is in theory what we want. TypeScript's going to complain about a few things as we see here. But what this does is, this is a really handy function. I think it's just like native to the browser, and there's a difference between like the browser functions and JavaScript. So I think this is actually native to the browser. Anyway, it's saying, okay, the input component is a ref, current is the element. This function returns a whole lot of different values, an object with a lot of different values, including the left positioning, I think, within the viewport of this element. So we've pretty much got the values we want here, but before we move on, I'm going to say, I'm just going to appease this. So if I remember right, that will appease it. We're just saying, since that could be undefined, we're just going to use this syntax. And I could have used like the question mark dot syntax, but I actually wanted to give it a value of 0 otherwise. So let's see if it's happy with this. So here's the next problem, since we're using TypeScript. This input component.current is not typed properly. So the next thing we need to do is go up to our useRef and tell it exactly what it's gonna, what its typing is. So we're gonna simply give it this HTML input element. Not sure if this null value is required, but I'll go ahead and add that in there. And just from that, we're pretty much where we want to be. I'm going to add a little bit more code to protect against something that I'd see happening every now and then. Oh, there it is. We see this happening every now and then, but I bet as soon as I select a value, you see how it popped over here. What's going on there is that, what I think is going on is that when that ref is initially getting calculated, that left value from that ref, then this component probably hadn't fully rendered yet. It's probably like up here in the top left. So we saw that its left value was just shoving this way over here to that side. And that's not what we want. Oh, and also, of course, one more thing to do here. I'm going to go ahead and add in the offset on that. So may as well see it in its full glory before we fix that bug. So now you can see it. We've already got that offset done. So here we're like 98% of the way done, but we got to protect against that little bug happening. And it wasn't happening every time. Here I've refreshed it, but here we go. Looks like it's pretty much happening every time for us. So definitely need to protect against that. How do we protect? Well, we simply add in a use effect that says anytime that position value changes, or that position value, that input component changes, then we need to recalculate a position value. So I'm going to create the position value that our left value can be taken from. Started out as 0. And I'm going to, in a moment, replace all this code with this position value, but I don't want to wipe it out yet because I want to copy paste it. So anyway, we've got our input component, we've got our position. Let's go down here and add in this use effect. And we're going to say input component. So now we need the actual code in here. We're going to say set position and simply pass it this code that we've already got down here. And I'm going to call this position instead. And there we go. So now that should solve, oops, gotta make sure that this is an array of observables, not just a single observable. And VS Code will catch up eventually, but TypeScript is happy. All right, so we'll see if that fixed our problem. Yay, immediate rendering in the proper location. So there might be other ways to solve for that bug, or that problem where it was rendering over on the left, but obviously this way was working. So now we have a fully featured single select, and I'm going to move on to the multi-select. I want to mention that I'll have a link to all of this code to an article that has all of this code in the video details. So if you want this, it is in the video details. And you're going to see that I'm going to adjust some of it quite a bit to make the multi-select work. So moving on to the multi-select then, we need to, it's largely about changing the typing of a couple things. And it's probably going to be cranky with me along the way, because some things are no longer going to make sense to the compiler, basically until we have it fully flipped over to an array. So we need to first update our use state to be an empty array. By default, that's expecting string values. And right away, yeah, it's already unhappy here. So next up, we're going to change some of these conditional renderings, because let's see, it's not even going to show us right now, but I'm going to go ahead and change some of these conditional renderings to use length, and just that I don't forget to do that. We've got a render value, and let's change our score in the label to look at length. So these are saying if it's not 0, or in other words, if it's a truthy value, which means it has to be something not 0, and we can't have negative values for our length. So if it's a truthy value, that means that the score array has at least one value in it, and we're good to go. So next up is our render value here. Let's give it some typing. And since it's an array, I'm going to go ahead and call it values. All right, so actually, that's not quite right. So we're saying here that if our render value is, at least one item in a string array, then what we actually want to do is not just render values, we want to do a join on them. This is our render logic for what is visually displayed after selection in that text input area. And we're going to join with a comma space. All right, so we're largely good now, just a few typings and some changes to the set score in our event handler here. So I'm going to change this simply to an array, and the docs really had a great example of how to pull the value out of the event. So I'm just going to pretty much keep that how it was. Isn't this cool here? They're taking the event and they're just using like built-in JavaScript syntax to ultimately drill down to this value here through event.target.value. Cleaner than I initially had it, so that's pretty cool. You could say I value it. Anyway, that was a bad joke. So we're just checking on the value. We kind of don't even need this code, this logic here, except that TypeScript wants it. So this value is coming in as an array of values. It's never actually coming in as this string, but anyway, we'll just have this in here to appease. In fact, I'll go ahead and show you. If I just have value, I think it's going to be grumpy. We'll see. Maybe I can just... Nope, there it goes. Of course. So it doesn't like just having value. It wants to make sure, since it could be a string or an array of strings, that it's going to be working either way. So anyway, with that, those changes, suddenly we should have multi-select. Oh, not yet. You know why? I forgot one important thing. All right, so it's not working quite yet, and the question is why. It's actually still working fine as a single select, and it's because I forgot one simple thing that changes some of the internal behavior of the select. So if that re-renders, I'll make it re-render. There we go. There we go. Just adding that multi-select prop, you can see the menu stays open, and it is concatenating the values up here. So that's all you got to do. Don't forget that multiple prop. It's not called multi-select, which is what I thought at first. But anyway, this multiple prop here, that's all you need. And with that, we have a fully working, highly customized, and well-typed Material UI Select component.